Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm joined by Professor Antony Turton. He's an expert, among other things, in South Africa, and South Africa's water supply, things of that sort. So, Prof, welcome.
Good evening to you and the listeners. Pleasure to be here on a very busy day. Lots of media interviews today.
Tell me, when there's a water crisis in the country, that's when you get busy, right?
I'm afraid I'm one of a few people that, there are not too many of us around and we just get inundated. But nonetheless, it's always good to talk to the journalist, because I always believe that the journalist is a very important link between the technical savvy people in the country and the population. Otherwise, they don't get to know what's going on in their country. So it's my pleasure to be on your show.
So when I spoke to you, it was, I guess, almost a year and a half ago, we dug very deeply into South Africa's water crisis. And I'd just like to remind the listeners that this crisis that you've been talking about for years and been writing about is not new, right? Can you maybe just give us a backdrop as to what the situation is with water in South Africa? Let's go before the Johannesburg crisis, before we dig into this one.
So you want the broad background as to...
I think last time you said 2002, we ran out of water.
Okay, right. So we'll start off in when we became a democracy in 1994. I think that's really the best place to start, because you must appreciate that one of the elements of apartheid was the influx control. People were not free to move where they wanted to. So immediately we became a democracy. The very first thing that happened, before the laws even changed, was that people started moving to city centers. And that's really where you can say the genesis of the crisis, because there was no available land, and you just had tens of thousands of people streaming into the cities. Of course, this was welcomed by some political parties because it swelled the voting ranks of certain political parties. And the only place that these people could settle was in informal settlements, very often close to tailings dams. And you'll know that just recently we've had a tailings dam disaster in Jagersfontein. So there's that little tailings issue that is a nasty little thing sitting on the side. But then subsequent to that, 1998, the very first law that was passed in a democratic South Africa was the National Water Act. And it was deemed to be a revolutionary act, because what it did was it took away the individual right to water. There was no more water rights anymore. So that meant that if you were a landowner, a farmer that owned land, you no longer owned the water under your land or flowing over your land. And that was the purpose of the National Water Act. It was a political instrument. But what that then did was it then created a bureaucratic need, because every single individual now is a water user, and every single water user has to get a water use license. And to get a water use license costs hundreds of thousands of rand, if not millions of rand. Our mines pay millions of rand for their water use licenses, and it has to be renewed periodically, like your driver's license. And so every entity has a water use license, and the purpose of it was to gain control over water. But unfortunately, without the bureaucratic capability to administer that system has slowly fallen apart, much like your driver's license system or people that own firearm licenses. Exactly the same. It's a replication of the same thing.
Right. So the state does not have the competency, basically.
The state doesn't have the competency. But now if we fast forward to 2002, the National Water Act mandates a thing called the National Water Resource Strategy. And that's supposed to be published every 5 years. And it's supposed to be the latest update of the balance between demand and supply in all of the 19 water management areas. 3 have been done, but only the first one actually had scientific foundation to it. Or the number 2 and number 3 were simply repetitions of number 1, and they really are devoid of any current numbers. So in 2002, when the National Water Resource Strategy was published, I was actually a part of the team that did that work. And we found, to our shock and horror, that of the total volume of water we have in South Africa, the resource, what's known as the resource, the water in the river and dam, we had already allocated 98% on average. And more importantly, some of the water management areas had been over-allocated by as much as 120%. Okay. So in other words, we effectively...
Just pause you there, just if you don't mind for a second, because a lot of people would listen to that and say, but wait a minute, I still have, okay, unless you live in Johannesburg, I still have water in my tap. How do you explain that in a seemingly contradiction?
Well, okay, the water in your tap is important to you as the consumer of that water, but of the total volume of water in the national economy, that's a very, very small amount of water. The water in your tap accounts for maybe 2 liters per person per day, if you want to drink, and it accounts for maybe 200 liters per person per day if you want to bath and flush your toilet.
Right.
That's small water. The medium water is really big water. That's the water that sustains your economy, keeps your companies going, keeps the economy going. But the truly big water is water for food. Every calorie of food requires 1 liter of water, plus minus ballpark number. So a diet of 3,000 calories per day is 3 tons of water per person per day. So the National Water Act or the water use license, it has as its function the balancing out of those competing demands. And because each of these demands are put in a priority, your potable water use, your human consumption is the highest level of priority. Right. And it is designed, the engineered systems are designed to give you a 98% assurance of supply, which means that in 100 years you can have 2 breakdowns. Or 1 breakdown in 50 years. That's what it means. But then you've got the next level, which is your industry, etc. And then underneath that, you've got just generally the economy. Then at the very bottom of that, you've got agriculture. So just because people have got water in the taps doesn't mean to say there's water in the rest of the system. So that's really what it's about. It's a balancing act about this invisible resource. There was visible resource, but people don't understand. And the other complex issues as well. And the one thing is the water quality. Because our water quality is deteriorating, the cost of producing clean, potable water is also going up exponentially. And that's a thing we can talk about later on if you want to. But that's a separate matter. That's a separate matter.
We'll get into that. So just to summarize what you're saying, basically you're saying legislation enacted in 1994, whether for good or bad reason, either way, it resulted in the balls up that we've got at the moment, where the state does not know how to allocate resources. And that is where the primary issue lies, okay? But then simultaneously, there's been a lack of infrastructure as well, lack of planning, a lot of long-term strategic planning, I assume.
Not necessarily. There was a lot of infrastructure. The old apartheid state, one thing that they were pretty good at was actually supplying infrastructure, particularly in the historically white areas. Yeah. And in fact, the fact that infrastructure has lasted for 2.5 decades before it's fallen over is really quite a remarkable thing. So I would say that the genesis of this thing really was the Uhuru moment, the moment when people were really excited about this new democracy. People were free to move as they wanted to, and that was wonderful. The warm, fuzzy, hugging moment. We liked that moment. But in the background, there were these other animals coming home to roost now. And then on top of that, now we get the next step in this crisis. And the next step in the crisis was the political imperative for representativity in society. So now we start getting affirmative action kicking in, and we start getting all these kind of the purging of skills out of the various arms of the civil service. That is a second factor, and that sort of slowly starts working its way through. And then there are other factors, because then you start getting into the BEE legislation now about procurement and how to procure your pumps and pipes, etc. And you start getting into the corruption sort of situation where you get these big syndicates that are now feeding off this procurement thing, and then the law trying to plug the leaks in procurement. So today, to procure anything is an absolute nightmare. Just to get a simple thing, just look no further than the CEO of Eskom right now, who's decrying the fact that for them to procure a bolt or a spanner or something for Kusile Power Station takes months and months of approval from Treasury. That's only because we become a corrupt society. So what I'm trying to say is that we've got all of these things, one on top of the other. But then there's another important thing that I would like to put on the table, seeing as we're going into depth now in this interview. What I would like to put on the table now is a constitutional issue. And people will raise their eyes and say, how can the water be a constitutional issue? Well, very simple. There's a clause in the Constitution called the Cooperative Governance Clause. And everyone says that's wonderful to have that thing. And what it says is that one government department may not stick its nose in the business of another government department. That's essentially what it says. But then it also says that government departments will cooperate with each other. Now, that's all good and well, but the unintended consequence of that warm and fuzzy statement is that the Department of Water and Sanitation is unable to act as a regulator. So when the municipality is now failing, because they're not collecting the money, etc., they can't pay Rand Water, so Rand Water's failing because they're not getting the money in, so they can't invest into their pipeline upgrades, etc. So this chain reaction starts happening, and then you get this clause kicking in, this cooperative governance clause, where the Department of Water and Sanitation under the former Minister of Water Affairs, Nomvula Mokonyane, she said we may not prosecute a municipality. And as a result of that, today we have the municipalities that are failing, but more importantly, the municipalities being responsible for the wastewater treatment in the country. We now have an untreated flow of 5 billion litres of sewage every day flowing into our rivers and dams because of the cooperative governance clause. Now, this is okay. So I mean, that doesn't make sense, but this is one of those factors. And I'd like to just say one more thing if I might, just to add a bit more texture to this. Now, this is the stew that we're cooking here now. It's a poiki cross we're putting together here now. And what also happened was, in this euphoria of the moment, in this enthusiasm of Uhuru, a decision was made to democratize water. And part of it now was what the department used to do, what the national department used to do, was handed over to the municipalities at the very same time that the municipalities were being amalgamated. So the weak ones were coming together with the strong ones, at the very same time that affirmative action was kicking in, very same time that white skills were being purged out of the system. So all of those things happened simultaneously. So we had to pass the ball, throw the rugby ball from the national department to the municipalities, and they couldn't catch the ball because there was no one there that understood how to catch this ball and what to do with it. And as so long on a very, very robust infrastructure, your urban areas generally they sort of went chugging on for 2 decades, even with all of these stresses. But eventually they were completely overwhelmed. And now when they're overwhelmed, now it's going to take a decade or two to suddenly say, oh wow, we're overwhelmed. What do we need to do now? Because all of the institutions are broken, and it's the institutions that have to make the decisions and the long-term planning, and they need skills, etc. So we get into that sort of really, really ugly situation now. But that's where we are today. That's the reality.
What you're saying to me, if I'm a guy in Johannesburg, fortunately I don't stay there, and I don't have water at the moment, and I want to point a finger, I want to go and knock on somebody's door, I'm going to be pointed in different directions because everyone is sort of saying this is not my responsibility, or this is the municipality, this is the Department of Water Affairs, etc., etc.
Yes, if ever you want to amuse yourself for a while, just go through all the different bits of legislation that deals with water. And you'll find that water is the single most cross-cutting issue of any in the country. So, for example, the Labour Department, water is it's a human rights issue. Therefore, it's a labour relations issue. Health, Department of Health. You've got to have water for hospitals, etc. Right. It's an educational issue. It's an agricultural issue. It's you name it, wherever it is. And then you've got different government departments. You've got COGTA, then you've got municipalities, then you've got provincial government departments, then you've got national, then you've also got the Department of Environmental Affairs responsible for wetlands and rivers. So it's an absolute nightmare. And into that mix, we now add something else. We add the mining industry, where you've got this massive, gargantuan, messy pile of toxic waste that's been dumped on the landscape over the last 120 years, and that all goes back into the water. So water is just a messy, messy, messy business, and that's part of the problem. You see, we've got to cut through the politics of this thing, and we've got to start saying, listen, water is a national strategic priority. I would even like to say that water is a national security issue. Right. We've actually got to get to that point where it's a national security issue, and we've got to, it's not about the color of your skin anymore or about which political party you support. It's about how do we keep this economy going, that we can employ people, with dignity so that they can work their way out of poverty, and more importantly, that the economy can continue to generate taxes to sustain the very ministers that are busy rewarding themselves as we speak right now through the ministerial handbook with all of these lavish gifts that they're getting from us, the people. So people are getting a little bit angry with this thing at the end of the day, and I just hope that tolerant people like myself, we have our limits to how far we can be pushed before we start biting back.
So when you say a national security issue, and I sort of agree with you, and the reason I say this, I studied with people from the Middle East. My wife's from the Middle East. They also have water issues. Okay. Turkey occupies the Kurdish area because they have all the water in the Middle East, for example, right? There's a lot of security issues. There's armies patrolling dams. We know Israel one stage at the part of the Jordan River, all those things. So South Africa is a dry country. I think it's the 25th driest in the world, if I'm not mistaken. How would one go then to manage water? Like, would it just be a national issue and you have a national department and that's it? Or how does do that?
I think we would go back to managing water as a national strategic issue. When I say it's a security issue, it doesn't have to be managed by securocrats. But you've got to just have legislation in place that recognizes that, for example, Rand water is a national key point. And recognizing that, if someone steals the fence around the pump station, that's an important issue, and someone must go and fix it up. So it's those simple things. It's about I don't want to easily cite Mayor Rudy Giuliani when he was in New York, but the broken window syndrome. We've got to get back to that kind of thing where we've got to say, how do we stop people going into electrical transformers and stealing the copper inside there? How do we stop people stealing the motors on the sewage pumps because they want to get a couple of $100 worth of copper out of it? See, this is the security issue, because if we don't get that right, then ultimately, in security terminology, the state then starts facing an existential crisis. And the existential crisis means that the state is unable to exist as a viable entity. And this is where I think we are starting to go now. We're starting to approach that threshold. If you look at cosmology, you get a thing called a black hole. When a star collapses, you get a black hole at the center of a solar system, and that starts swallowing up all of the planets around it. Well, that's what happens here. We get this black hole occurring, and that black hole we call state failure, and it just sucks everything into it over time. And where's the dignity in that? Where's the ability to feed a family and to work your way out of poverty and send your kids to school? Where's all of those good things in life? You can't do that under those circumstances. So that's the security I'm talking about. The security of the nation, not the security of the state.
Right. So I want to just touch on the 2 points that you raised. I think it's a few years ago, because I've been following your work for some time now. The first one is, I can't remember how many years ago it is now, you made a statement where you say, if we don't solve the water issue, we cannot grow the economy. Now, this should be self-explanatory, but can you maybe elaborate why that is the case, that the economy cannot grow without water?
Yeah, well, when I was at the CSIR, after this National Water Resource Strategy was published, remember many of the scientists were involved in the National Water Resource Strategy development, so they were intimately involved. And when we realized that we'd reached this point of 98%, and then the scientists realized that you actually can't measure between 98 and 100, that 2%, you can't actually measure that accurately enough, at national level. So that's the margin of error we're dealing with. So we realized then that, we've got this crisis, and we reached out to government, and the problem was government was not interested in listening to science. Believe it or not, government was not interested in listening to science.
I believe it, yeah.
Okay, and as a result of that, I was a senior fellow at the CSIR, and I was made the media spokesperson, because we, the scientists, decided that if government won't listen to us, then maybe the scientists should talk to the media, to talk to society through journalists. And I actually proposed a thing called Science in the Service of Society. And for that reason, they actually sent me on media training program that I could, in fact, become the media spokesperson. Okay. And that's where I learned how to deal with the media. So we are engaged now really in that science in the service of society thing. And, this is what we've got to do. We've got to educate people, but we mustn't alarm them. We've got to sort of get this new idea together about where we've got to go in the future. But, we've kind of lost our way, I'm afraid. We just don't quite know where we are in this morass. But every one of these problems is entirely soluble. And we just got to break it down. We've got to break this, this dilemma. We're sitting in a dilemma at the moment. And that dilemma is a dilemma technically is something where all alternatives are equally unappealing. And that's where we are today. We're sitting in this national dilemma, and we've got to break that dilemma down now into bite-sized chunks. And every water problem every problem by definition is a soluble problem. So then we've got to work these problems at ordinary level. And I've spoken before at great length about this. We manage water as a stock, as a single finite resource, but actually it's a flux. It moves in time and space. And that simple one sentence there is a very eloquent statement of actually what we should do in the future. But we've got to unleash those, the science and engineering and technology to start recycling, reprocessing, upskilling people, etc. We've got to get technology, got to get capital into the space, and all of that is possible.
So I wonder, that was going to be my second question, is for you to re-explain to the audience the difference between water being a stock and being a flux, and why that is so critical, and why that informs the solutions that we should be looking for.
Yes, a stock is something that is finite, and you use it once and you then throw away the waste. So, for example, coal or oil in the ground, that is a stock. There's a finite amount of coal or oil in the ground, and you dig it out or you pump it out, and then you create waste. And so you use it once, and then everything else that you have thereafter is waste. So we do that with water. We take water as a stock, we measure it as a cubic meter of water, a finite volume, and we then discharge it now down our toilets or down these sewers, ultimately as waste, and we forget about it. But in reality, water is a flux, and a flux, to get into the mathematics of it, it's the volume multiplied by time. So if you take 1 liter of water multiplied by the number of times that you can use it, okay, then you start getting into solution. Now, getting back to what I was talking about just now, when the CSIR got very alarmed about this, we realized then, we started doing extrapolations into the future, and we started saying that if we continue to consume water the way we are currently consuming it, we've already run out of this water, but what's going to happen now? What are the thresholds that we can anticipate going forward? And then we started doing some interesting calculations, and we realized that by 2025, we're going to run into the absolute limit, and at that, what we needed there was the number 63. We needed 63 billion cubic meters of water, and what we had available was 38. 38 is the total volume of all the water in all the dams, but that's the national resource.
So we almost needed to double it, basically.
Equals 38. So, yeah. But 38 is a stock. 38, our stock of water is 38 billion cubic meters.
So that is all the water in the rivers and the dams, basically.
That's all the water in strategic storage, assuming that all of the dams are 100% full.
Okay, fair enough.
And assuming that the dams are not silted up.
So why can't we build new dams?
Because we've got no more water left in the rivers to fill the dams.
Okay, fair enough.
It's as simple as that. Okay, that's another conversation. We can go into that. Okay. So, but what we then did, we made this extrapolation, said that so what we do, we've now got to make a decision. Are we going to go on a slow growth economic trajectory over time and grow slowly, but not consume our water too much and protect us, kick the can down the road into the future? Or are we going to grow the economy fast so that the born-frees, remember the born-free generation, the people that have never known apartheid, are you one of them, okay?
I'm born 1990, so I'm just out of the club.
Okay, so the born-free generation, just to employ the born-free generation, we need 7% economic growth per annum sustained for the next 2 decades. So we've got to become like China. We've got to become like China just to employ the born-frees. Now, that's an important thing. That's one simple little statement I made now. It's a very, very important statement. So we then said, so if we only have 38, that's all we have. And then we looked at climate change, and we said that climate change is actually making that 38 get less and less and less. And now we're throwing sewage into that, so the 38 is getting even more, even less and less and less. So how do we make 38 equal 63? That's the problem. And if you multiply 38 by 1.6, you get 63. So in other words, the solution is to use the national water resource, recycle it 1.6 times by 2025. That's what we said in 2005, 2006. So had we listened then, had people listened then, we could have done it. Now we got to do it by tomorrow. That's just to give you an indication of how big that number is. So that additional amount of water that we need, the difference between 38 and 63, that's our national deficit of water. So that's the size of a potential market for water, if you want to call it that. If you want to use commercial terms, but that is equal to 2/3 of the volume of all of our dams combined together, and we have to do that in the next 10 years.
Is that even possible?
Well, it's if we don't do it, then what? Then we slowly succumb to this low growth, the slow sort of onset disaster, the slow growing revolution because people are mired in poverty, etc. So these are the choices. We either take it seriously, make it a national security issue, say, right, we're putting the best guys in the place, we're not going to steal the water, we're not going to steal the money, we're going to get the appropriate procurement policies in place, people aren't going to enrich themselves out of this thing, because now if you get into engineering parlance, we're now multiplying that water through society, but as we multiply that water as a flux, you're taking the wastewater, recycling it back, and does it make a sense to flush your toilet with drinking water? Does it make a sense to cool down your cooling tower in a factory with drinking quality water? Absolutely not. So then we start going to different water of different quality for different purposes at different prices, and now we start seeing economic growth. But more importantly, in order to do that, it's going to cost something like 1 trillion rand. 1 trillion rand, that's the number. Just up a ton, 1 trillion, easy like that. But with engineering skills applied properly, a very low multiplier would be 3. Very low multiplier, you can probably make it more than that. So if you multiply that trillion within the economy, what's known as the velocity of the transactions that are unleashed, that becomes 3 trillion rand sloshing around the coffers of society, every transaction initiating or triggering taxes. So therefore, the fiscus starts getting money and you recycle that money around. Money, like water, is a flux that flows in time and space. So we mustn't be overcome by this big number where we must just manage it sensibly and properly and not steal it. That's really what it comes down to. Be wise with it, and we can solve these problems.
Okay, so you're making the argument that solving the water crisis will act as a catalyst for economic growth. I mean, it should again be a very obvious point, like solving the electricity crisis simultaneously. You cannot have growth without it, right? Then I want to get, so people here actually, who are living in Johannesburg, they want to ask, what happened? Why don't they have water at the moment? What is the crisis about?
Okay, so the crisis at the moment is about the fact that Rand Water is pumping at the limit of its water use license. Getting back to the little licensing issue I spoke about earlier, Rand Water can only pump a certain volume because there are other users in the system that have also got entitled to use water. So they're at the limit of their rights. But more importantly, because those rights are defined on a piece of paper, all of the engineering designs are based on that flow. So your pumps and your pipes and your storage is all sized on that flow. But now in the meantime, I mentioned earlier on that people have been coming into Gauteng, so demand has been steadily increasing. At the same time that demand has been increasing, you've also got a breakdown of the system, so leaks are accelerating more and more and more. So in other words, we've now got a situation where demand for water exceeds supply, and this is exacerbated during a period of hot weather, when people now water their gardens more than they would normally do. The first rains, I'm told, haven't yet come into Gauteng. So that's a short-term stressor. And then another short-term stressor, this happens at the time when Eskom is not capable of feeding the national grid. So you've got two additional stresses. These are the straws that break the camel's back.
Okay.
So that's what's happening now. So in other words, if you take the total volume of water flowing into Gauteng, whatever that is, volume X, whatever it is, that you should have strategic storage capacity for that in the system for 48 hours. And at the moment, the strategic storage capacity for that is, I did a study for some big property developers in the Midrand area in 2017, 2018, about then. And there we found that the storage or retention time was down to 19 hours then. So in other words, it's probably down to 15, maybe less than that now. And that's the problem. Your
So
internal
we're eating
storage,
into the fat of the system, basically.
you need to expand your storage in the system, and then you need to fix the leak. So you want to store more water for longer, and then you want to stop the water leaking out before it gets to the end user. Those are the two things you've got to do, in the medium to long term.